So I'm excited to have the panel as well because we've talked more from the product side, and now we're going to talk more about how individuals can get involved in the cybersecurity space. More importantly, what's some low-hanging fruit within the open source ecosystem, interesting cybersecurity projects that people can participate in. So as we start here, I'd like the panel just to go down, maybe introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of your background.
Testing. My name is Jen Andre. I'm the founder and CEO of Komand. My background is, I started off in security operations, but have since mostly spent my career in product and engineering. So I have a lot of experience both using and kind of contributing to open source security tools.
What are you doing now?
Now I'm the founder and CEO of Komand. We're building security automation software.
Hey, I'm Dan Guido. I'm the founder and CEO of Trail of Bits. We're a low-level security engineering shop that builds security tools and security libraries for other companies. We've staked a lot of our reputation and a lot of our branding on the open source libraries that we've released. We like to help companies understand what value they can get out of open sourcing their code, and we have a lot of success stories to say about that. So I'm really happy to be here and to talk about some of those. My background is definitely like way down the stack where I'm talking C, C++, compilers, programming languages, that kind of stuff. That's my area.
And I'm, excuse me, Andrew Becherer. I'm the Chief Security Officer at DataDog. DataDog does infrastructure and application performance monitoring as a service. The company obviously is heavily dependent on open source, and we also, our agent is open source, and we contribute to a number of projects. My background, I was an application developer way back in the day before I transitioned full-time into security, working at ISEC Partners with this guy for a while, and then ultimately became the pointy-haired boss that was referred to in the keynote in my current role at Datadog, running the security program there.
Great. Well, thank you guys all for being here. Just surveying the audience, how many of you guys are actively involved in any of the open source security projects out there? So just a few. How many would be interested in getting involved? All right. Good. All right, so hopefully we can teach you guys something here. How many of you are non-technical, so therefore feel like you wouldn't be able to get involved? Okay. Liam, of course. So maybe let's start and just talk about some of the more popular open source projects or open source projects that you guys are interested in at the security level, because I think it would be helpful just to sort of get a gauge of what's popular out there and why it might be popular. I don't know if Jen or Dan, you want to start?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. So I'll talk about personal interests of mine. That's probably the easiest way to get going here. There's two projects in particular that Trail of Bits offers that I think have like widespread applicability to people in this audience. We released a set of Ansible scripts, so infrastructure automation scripts that help you set up your own personal VPN. Most people are probably familiar with the enormous amount of news about the FCC decision to allow ISPs to do bad things with your data. We saw a lot of interest in that code base after that decision, and a lot of the commits, a lot of the contributions, a lot of the users tend to be people that are non-technical and that have never worked with or contributed to an open source program before. I think that was like kind of, one area where you can satisfy kind of a personal need or desire to like, oh, I want to protect my own data, but then also use some open source code and potentially make a contribution while doing so. On the other hand, we have tools that we offer to people that are competing in CTFs. So I'm a big fan of Capture the Flag, which is not exactly the topic of this conversation, but I will pitch it for 10 seconds here. Capture the Flag challenges are probably the easiest way to gain skills in the cybersecurity industry in the most compressed time period possible. And what you can do is, instead of just applying brute force to solve those challenges in the CTF competitions, you can try to take an open source tool and see what it does for you. So we offer something called Manticore, which is a binary analysis tool. And if you're trying to solve a binary reverse engineering or exploitation challenge in a CTF, you can use our tool to help you. And there might be opportunities after that where, okay, now that you're a user, Now you can become a contributor, and after you're a contributor, then you become a developer. Like, it needs to progress like somehow, so the easiest way to do it is to just try and get started in like a low risk way, like a CTF. All right, that was a lot.
No, it's good. Jen, do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would take an approach by basically looking at tools that you might use on a day-to-day basis in your job or areas that you're interested in. So rather than just looking for like, hey, there's all these big popular open source projects, I think it's important, especially when you're contributing to open source, that you find something that you're actually interested in. So, for me, working on a lot of different, I would say, network or host intrusion detection style tools. So, Go Audit was one released by Slack. I haven't contributed to this, but basically another nicer library for interfacing with auditd, or the audit system in Linux. Like, if you're interested in that sort of like endpoint, low-level stuff, that might be a good one to look at. If you're interested in like network protocol analysis or intrusion detection, Leah mentioned Bro. It's a very popular one out there. Start with something that you're interested in. And again, like no matter where you're working, there's probably someone who has some open source tool out there of varying maturity and complexity to contribute to, but that's where I would start.
Andrew, I'll change this up a little bit for you. Just as the pointy-haired CISO at your company, how important is it for a candidate looking for a gig at your job to have committed to a project or for them to have leveled up their skills working on an open source security project?
It's in particular for security programs like we run at DataDog. It's a huge point in that candidate's favor. We of course use a significant amount of open source in running our security operations, and so we use things like Go Auditd that Jen mentioned, also ElastAlert from the folks at Yelp, and other tools. And so certainly, it illustrates a certain level of engagement and competence when you've participated in an open source project and have actually committed back to it. It also gets to an important point in terms of the value of contributing to open source for people in the workforce, which is on in-house security teams, as opposed to my consulting background, you can be kind of isolated in terms of it can be difficult to engage outside your organization. All the things we work in are sensitive. Your management may or may not be super happy with you speaking externally about the problems that your organization is specifically facing. But if you can get support for either contributing to an open source tool or one thing that in-house teams have that those consulting folks don't is access every day to production workloads, right? And problems, to be solved that you can actually have an opportunity. I mean, that's where Go Auditd comes from. That's where ElastAlert comes from. That's where OS Query comes from. And so it's a really great opportunity for you on in-house teams in order to, engage with the greater community and open up those doors for your future opportunities.
So I'm curious from a non-technical background, because I have a non-technical background. Everybody is trying to get into, or a lot of people are interested in getting more involved in the cybersecurity space. It's a growing industry. There are a lot of jobs, as we've highlighted in previous talks. Are there opportunities within the open source community for non-technical people to get involved, and how might they do that? Whether it's a product person, whether it's a salesperson, a marketer, are there any suggestions or tips that you might have for somebody like that? Dan? I'll throw you on the spot.
Yeah, sure. That can be a difficult sell, because open source projects typically don't have like a sales need, but they do have to try to collect users. So it's really important for an open source project to have a pipeline, not unlike a sales pipeline for a commercial company. There needs to be enough users in order to generate enough contributors, in order to generate enough developers, in order to move the project forward. So opening up that pipeline by making it welcoming to people that are on the lower end of the technicality spectrum is really important. So when I first published Algo, those VPN scripts I mentioned before, it was very important to me that I ironed out all the issues that people who are unfamiliar with that project would have. So a lot of times the valuable contributions that were made were like, I followed this run script exactly, and it didn't do what I wanted to. And sometimes just a simple bug fix of like a change of wording in a sentence can help an enormous number of users that I didn't know existed gain access to the project because they lacked some kind of domain-specific knowledge. So that was valuable to me when we were starting off, and now I have like an encyclopedia of documentation on Algo, which is great. But like those are some really simple things that I think maybe you might discount as someone that hasn't tried it before. Because from a maintainer's perspective, that's a blind spot that you can fix that I can't. Because I have that domain-specific knowledge. So I just wave my hands over it and I know what happens.
Yeah, I would agree. Documentation is one of the hardest things and one of the biggest, I think, barriers to a lot of people either using or contributing to open source projects. So in addition to like anything you kind of run into when you're installing the software that you're using, also any documentation you can help around actually contributing. So a lot of, I think, open source developers will put something out there and not really document how to contribute to the project, document architecture level stuff. And again, this is a little bit more technical contributions, but it's still stuff that I think there's a huge gap for in a lot of open source projects. I think just generally, you can also look for projects where it doesn't require you to be a developer and engineer to actually contribute to it. So popular examples of this would be like writing OS query packs for OS query. As a user, you can contribute valuable content that helps the community, but you don't necessarily have to be a software engineer to do it.
Andrew, anything else you'd like to add?
I think the one other thing I'd add is open source projects, in order for them to become successful, a lot of them have a reputation for being very difficult to engage with. Sometimes the original contributors, they didn't create this thing because they wanted to engage with the community. And so successful communities will have, they'll have websites, they'll have documentation, they'll have IRC channels or Slack groups or whatnot. And that stuff doesn't create itself, right? And so certainly, non-technical individuals can get involved on the community side of open source. But as Dan alluded to, in some projects that can be something of a tough sell with maybe the original organizers. But certainly it's a much needed contribution.
And I'll pause. If anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in, and I can pause here to see. Does anybody have a question to ask? No? Okay. Dan, so, yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Sure. I mean, we went through this when we released Manticore as well, where we tried to look at best practices around the industry to see what they did. So we looked through the Django project. We looked through a couple of other big Python libraries. And we ended up mimicking a lot of that behavior when we published our code base, because there's kind of a responsibility on us that if we're going to release something as open source, we have to do that legwork to engage with the community and encourage contributions and build a user base. So we felt that was important. And that's also, like, from your perspective, from everyone's perspective, if you're thinking about working with an open source code base, these are things to think about before you try, because some projects, just like Andrew has said, and I've alluded to as well, that some projects are just not friendly to work with. There isn't a community there. You won't be able to find help. The documentation's not great. You might want to focus on ones that are, at least at first. But yeah, so we ended up using stuff like Read the Docs to do hosted, auto-generated documentation. We used the wiki to document our architecture and the layout of all the source code in the code base and tell you what file does what. We made it build in one step so that it was easy to install, and we gave you copy and pastable shell scripts that you could just paste into your terminal and you could get the code base. We have an FAQ that acknowledges that there are certain paths that users will go down. As much as we document the software, they're still going to go sideways here, so we may as well provide them some guidance when they do. Those are really basic things, but it's lost on many people that believe that code is self-documenting and if you need to fix this, just read it. There's a lot more help that you could provide. So anybody that wanted to ever contribute something that was in one of those areas for open source code that I released, I would be very welcoming to receive it.
So with open source in the security space, we've been looking at contrasting arguments, from say larger government and enterprise customers. Open source is less secure because it's open, and open source is, for open source components, is more secure because it's open. I've noticed some different, security events that happened the past couple years. Say OpenSSL, when there was a really critical vuln that came out years ago, and we found out that there was actually, like 10 people in Europe that were controlling, the ability to patch that and do it timely. How do we protect against and sort of mitigate, vulnerabilities found in open source at sort of the structural level of the project, right? That we don't end up with a project where we could potentially have something like OpenSSL again, where it's not structured enough and we're all dependent upon it.
Okay. Attacking the big questions here. Yeah, all right, so I'll start. So the first thing is that it's a...
Do you want to just give a high-level repeat of the question?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple things involved in answering that question, or in asking that question. So the first was there are perceptions that being open source or being closed source influences the security of a code base. And I want to address that first because I feel like it's a very common misconception that it's very easy to clear up. Being open or closed does not affect the security of a code base at all. What affects it is how well the developers working on it are trained, the architecture that you've chosen to write the code with, the development frameworks that you use, the language that you used, whether it's ever received any kind of third-party review, also the customers that it has. If the customers that it has care about security, they're going to ask more questions and be more demanding on whether they use it or not. All that influences the security of a code base way more than it being open or closed source. Did I agree?
100%.
All right, awesome. So the second part of your question was how do we address the kind of systemic third-party risk issues of security libraries and software libraries that are integrated into products that we use but that we don't know about? I don't know. It's not a problem that's specific to open source. Like very frequently you can find, like every antivirus vendor out there contracts to the same like 2 or 3 different companies that produce unpackers for all the different file formats they use. That's a closed source code base, but a bug in one of them ends up producing a bug in 50 different antivirus programs. And how you effectively coordinate a patch for that is just massively complicated, and there's always going to be people that are on the tail end of that spectrum that just don't ever fix issues. Like I think a lot of times people need to think about how difficult issues are to exploit rather than just how difficult they are to find. So thinking about exploit mitigations and defense in depth as we like publish our own software. So here's a great example. Build scripts for open source software. It would be great if people would contribute fixes to them. So they used stack cookies, control flow guard, and control flow integrity, and other compiler protections that make vulnerabilities like those unexploitable or extremely difficult to exploit. And those are one-line changes sometimes that developers aren't aware of, that if you turn them on, it makes the product or project incredibly safe or much more safe to use. So that that's one thing that people in here can do. Like if we just control flow integrity the world, we'd be a lot safer.
And Andrew, coming at this from more of a corporate level, how do you guys evaluate an open source project being more secure versus less secure? Like, what is your opinion on that when adopting something internally at your company?
Sure, I think what I'd say is, it gets back to Dan's point that it really doesn't make it, the open source versus proprietary closed methodology doesn't make a difference, right? Because it does matter how a project is supported, how it's architected, what it's written in, and whatnot. That's much more valuable. I think, obviously, OpenSSL we discovered was, a critical part of our shared infrastructure. And what we decided to do as a society following its failure was we started forking the crap out of it, right? So now Amazon has their own S2N and Google has their own boring and how many other OpenSSL forks are there? There's got to be more.
I mean, a lot more people have jumped on Polar SSL, which renamed itself to Wolf SSL, which renamed itself to a different Embed TLS. Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah. So what we've decided, to do as a society, which may or may not be effective, is we get burned and then suddenly realize we need to invest effort in shoring that up, and we typically can't agree on how to invest that effort, and so we fork, right? Which is not necessarily the best thing, although I think if we go back to Dan Geer's monoculture paper, maybe it actually is the right thing. Maybe getting diversity in SSL libraries is actually the best way to protect society. But back to your question about corporate, as a person running a corporate security program, we look to how well supported a library is, what a library does, how it fits into the overall picture of what DataDog does, and what attack surface it exposes. Getting back again to the keynote, talking about how it's not about whether or not you will experience compromise, but whether or not you can protect the data that's most important in the event of compromise. That's what we get back to in terms of determining risk. But open source doesn't necessarily play directly into it as a development philosophy.
So Jen, in your experience of working on open source tools, what has drawn your interest to take your time to devote to supporting a particular open source tool versus not? And what are some of the projects that you find to be more popular, and why do you feel that they're more popular today?
Yeah, so from my experience, basically the things that have driven me to work on open source tools and software have been my need for them, to be honest, within either a work environment, so I'm on a team, and also obviously working at a startup. A lot of startups make use of open source software. You can't build quality software if you're building everything from scratch. So you have to, make use of stuff that's out there, that's been established. And just by your nature, you're contributing back any changes as much as you can. If you kind of have the philosophy that you're helping out the community as well.
What are some of the projects that you'd argue are best for somebody who's building something to leverage from an open source standpoint, at least within the security?
I would say not OpenSSL, so do not, unless you're, that's a very hard project to contribute to, unless you want to kind of work on documentation. That's been one area where I know OpenSSL has been lacking, at least from a user perspective. And by the way, just by documentation, I don't just mean adding something to an official documentation doc. Now, a lot of the ways developers figure out how to use things is they just use Google, right? So if you're adding stuff to Stack Overflow, if you have a blog where you're writing out your experience with some open source tool or library or something else, you're actually really helping out the community because of its valuable content that's going to get back to a user via SEO. Yeah, I think OS Query is another interesting one. Again, it requires certain skills. Like, I would look at your skill set, the problems you're looking to solve, and interesting projects that are in that space, because that's going to drive you to learn more about that particular tool, and because there's an investment involved, right, to actually contributing to an open source project, especially if you're doing it from a development perspective. So starting from something you're passionate about or interested in, I think is super important, because that's going to drive you to actually do the work.
Dan, obviously your company, Trail of Bits, there's a lot of incentive for you guys to work on these projects and support them for existing customers, but maybe touch on a little bit for us as to what projects you pick and why. Is it more customer driven, or is it more just interest driven internally at your company?
Sure. So the way that we've found this kind of virtuous cycle is that we work on a lot of code for government customers, for commercial clients, and when we build it, we usually convince them that open source is the right thing to do with this code base once it's there, that we'll be able to build a community around it, that Trail of Bits has an existing community that we can take advantage of in order to get some continued maintenance and some additional feature development that client, if they had kept it closed, it may have languished. So for instance, we've built things like application-specific fuzzers that we've then made more generic and released that get continued maintenance from our team as well as other people on the internet that are interested in using it. So the client eventually benefits from it. So we've also found a lot of benefit in terms of multiple clients of ours all paying us to contribute to one open source code base. Mixema and Manticore are great examples where we have many different people that are interested in funding us to work on code, but they don't want to pay me to write a product. But they will pay me to work on this community project, which is Manticore, or another one like that, that everyone can benefit from. So it's been good from kind of a sales perspective. The last thing I'd say is things like OS Query as well, like they give a potential client of my firm an opportunity to try it before they buy it without bringing lawyers into the conversation. And they can very easily prove that, okay, yes, this is a valuable activity for me to potentially engage with Trail of Bits on. So from like a corporate perspective, this has actually helped us generate sales as well. All those different things. And then I guess, sorry, finally, one last thing is we actually have received major contributions to our open source code after it's been released. For our binary lifter, which takes binaries and then reverses them back to an intermediate representation that a compiler uses, we've had people contribute support for x64 before we wrote it. For Algo VPN, we had somebody contribute support for EC2 before I was interested in supporting that feature. And these were all things that came about because we made it available for people to contribute stuff to, and other people had the same problems we did and, you know, were able to use it. So all those things helped with open source with me.
And Andrew, at DataDog, do you encourage your team to be working on open source projects? What's sort of the open source project that your team is most excited about? Or as a whole at your company, are you guys pursuing to support any particular project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have one security engineer who works on my team, and they've been working on a project they brought to DataDog and continue to work on, which is a Python static analysis tool, which has been very useful for us internally. DataDog's built on a great deal of Python and a good deal of Go, and so we've written security guides in both languages and have this tool that has been useful for finding a number of issues, and in particular, he tunes it towards some of the problems that have become a priority internally, and then we make use of a good deal of open source software, including I mentioned earlier, Go Audit D and ElastAlert, among other things. And so certainly there, my team hasn't made any contributions back to those specific projects yet, but certainly as we gain more depth of experience and have a longer track record using those services, I can imagine we would contribute back to them, just like the production engineering team at DataDog contributes back to the many open source projects that we leverage.
Let me pause there. Does anybody have any questions in the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. It was a poorly worded question. So you mentioned a static analysis tool in Python that you use. There's a lot of different metrics, so it's really common for people to analyze their code to see, like, hey, are they using an old version of this library? But it's less common to do like static analysis of Python code. Companies in the future try to go down that path as far as I want to statically analyze my code in order to protect against something.
Sure. Yeah. So what I'd say there is
Just retouch on the question for everybody.
yeah. So the question is, so DataDog, is developing an in-house Python static analysis tool, which is somewhat unusual for a company of its size, and although many, it's considered a best practice among security organizations to perform static code analysis, although frequently they'll rely, larger companies will rely on proprietary solutions, which come with their own bag of issues. What I'd say is, so what I did was I hired a really high-functioning security engineer who was writing a static analysis tool. And as a condition of retaining his employment, we both agreed that he would continue to manufacture this particular static analysis tool and then tune it to the specific requirements that DataDog had. Although even before that, so security, and static analysis like processes had been used for, well predating my participation at DataDog, whether it was just the use of simple linters to enforce convention, pre-commit hooks to look for specific issues that have been problematic in the past, or after my arrival, the use of more formal static analysis tools to look for specific classes of issues. Hopefully that somewhat addresses your question.
I feel like it's kind of funny that we're up here and we haven't talked about the gospel of AFL yet. So for those of you that don't know, AFL, or American Fuzzy Lop, is a software testing framework, or a fuzzer, that automatically generates purposefully bad inputs to a program in order to validate that the program can handle them. So that's also something that's very as a developer on a team that's working on a code base, whether it's open or closed source, AFL is an open source fuzzer that you can use to test your code in a way that allows you to punch far above your weight class. Even if you don't know all the techniques required to exploit those vulnerabilities or to reach all those different code paths, AFL will figure it out for you. And it can be a very low resource way to get a lot of benefit from open source tools, and then also potentially improve the code base that you're targeting it with. So lots of teams, whether they're writing in Python or any other language, can use things like that to accomplish very straightforward testing goals. There's another great one that I have to mention. If you're using an open source code base that compiles the LLVM, libfuzzer is typically better than AFL because it integrates more tightly with the code base and works in line with your compiles, whereas AFL is something that sits outside of it. But either of those two things are hugely valuable to the open source community and are things that you can take advantage of right now.
And I know we had a lot of students sign up for this event, and I would just be curious, maybe for each of you, from your experience, as these kids come out of school, maybe with a computer science degree or maybe with more of a information security tilt. What's the best way to start getting involved in a cybersecurity company? Or what are some of the things that they can do to start building their portfolio or resume to make themselves more interesting to a company in general?
Yeah, I mean, I personally believe that seeing a history of some sort of open source or community contributions says a lot about a candidate, that they're motivated. And again, not every person coming out of school has the time or energy or can actually do that. That said, I think for them to get involved in an open source project, there are a couple of interesting ways. If you have an area that you're interested in, you have identified some projects, look at that project's contributing guidelines. So a lot of projects will have a contributing.md, which will tell you where they need help. They'll mark certain issues as looking for help from a third party. That may be one way to get started. If you really just don't know, I think looking at Twitter or something else and finding the contributors and reaching out to them there, or on IRC or somewhere else, is another way to find areas that you can help and work on. I think almost every open source project has different things that they want help on, and if you can kind of identify exactly what those are, a lot of them are low-hanging fruit that a student can work on and again build their resume and portfolio that way.
And I know Komand, you guys are probably always hiring for security engineers and whatnot. So what are some specific things that you look for in a resume that's helpful, especially for a student coming out of school or maybe 1 or 2 years out of school?
Yeah, I think generally looking for motivation and drive. When you're at that stage in your career, you might not have a lot of experience or a lot of stuff on your resume yet, but showing us in some way that you're going to be motivated, that you can learn. We do a lot of take-home coding tests. We'll pair with you during an interview, stuff like that, to kind of get a sense of your attitude. And again, ahead of that, anything you can do in terms of documenting to an open source project, just showing what your interests are. That helps us give us a sense of who you are as a candidate.
Andrew, how about you? I mean, I'm sure you have experience trying to build out your security engineering team, and that's not easy to do. So what are some things that students can do to make themselves more a better candidate in your eyes?
Sure, yeah. And so what I'd say is in my career, both as a chief security officer and then before working in consulting, a lot of my best hires have been people that transitioned from general technical backgrounds or were new college hires and that had not done specific security work before. And the reason for that is because, security is not necessarily as special as some of us like to believe, and the problems are actually pretty general. And so with guidance, people can become very proficient practitioners very quickly. If I look back in particular to my career at ISEC, where I had longer tenure, a number of the most notable people who came out of there, that was their first security job, and in a short number of years they became very highly functional practitioners who are now doing incredible engineering work at some of the internet's foremost companies or running some of the largest security organizations in America. And so what I'd say is it is, as Jen was saying, about passion, right? So first you have to have a basic level of competence, right? And at DataDog, just because of the scale of operations today, we have to automate everything that can be automated, right? That's not unique to security. That's how DataDog operations works as well, the site reliability engineering team and whatnot. And then there is that passion for security, right? You have to there is a certain amount of sort of janitorial effort that comes along with any sort of job in security. And so a willingness to sort of understand the role that you perform and believe that it's valuable and see it as a mission and something that you want to do. You have to accept that or you're almost certain to burn out, right? Because it is high effort and stressful in that regard. And so yeah, those are the two things I'd say is one, first, you have to really apply yourself to your computer science program or to that in order to gain that basic level of competence. But then, really, investing in the idea of security and believing that it's important and being passionate, about it in your professional life, that's the second key, and being able to demonstrate that, which participation in a major, or minor open source project certainly goes a long way towards.
Yeah, there's very little that I can add to that. Basically, I think of security as a compositional field where you can't just learn security on its own and be good at it. You have to combine it with other skills that are available. So you have to be an expert in computer architecture and security, and then you can write exploits. Or you have to be an expert in programming languages and security, and then you can do something else. So don't forget to also learn like other stuff in this, in general tech, and then figure out how to apply it with a security mindset. The other thing, going back to hiring again, is we try to de-risk our hires by asking for some kind of portfolio of code, and that portfolio can come from any different area. It can come from open source contributions you've made, it can come from private code that you're willing to share with us, or we can actually give you a work sample test where you can write some code and we can look at it. But either way, as a small company, I don't have a lot of spots on my team. I need to make sure I get the right person every time, because one screw up could be like a really big deal for a company that's only 25 people in size. So I would gather the same for you, because how many security engineering spots are you really going to have, right? So you need to know that hiring discussion is a delicate one. So the most ways that you as a potential employee can de-risk the decision-making process for someone trying to hire you by showing more of what you can do ahead of time is going to benefit you. And if open source is the way you do that, fine. There are other ways too. I've seen people send in code samples that are private, and I've also had people request like, hey, give me something to do and I'll do it, and I'll show you what I can do. All acceptable answers.
You also earlier pitched CFPs, and so CFPs, participating in them can produce the artifacts that he's describing there.
Can you just explain for some of the people that don't?
Sure. I like that I get to describe CFPs on a panel with Dan here. So they're capture the flag tournaments, competitions, right? Some of the most famous of which, you know, are the DEF CON 1 or others. And basically, you know, some organization, it could be an educational institution or just a hacking collective, will arrange a tournament that has points associated with it, and you'll compete in challenges, and they could be things like they give you an image that is 1 pixel tall and 10,000 pixels wide, and you have to slice and dice it to reveal a flag in the image, which you then put into an online system and get points. Or it may be remotely exploiting, you know, some binary that's, you know, listening on a port, you know, or reverse engineering something, right? So there's a, you know, the challenges can be very broad in their nature. It could even be social engineering, right? And so, but what it does is it allows, you know, people to engage in offensive security activities in a safe and lawful manner, and also engage with a potentially interesting community.
Pico CTF is one I can strongly recommend. That's entry level, or you can go to ctftime.org and you can get a list of upcoming ones. But really, the goal when you're playing in CTF shouldn't be just bang on the keyboard and solve the challenge. Use a tool every time and write some code to solve the challenge. You'll learn more that way. And it's more impressive when you eventually show it to someone else on your resume or on a blog.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So just to take a step back, in your personal opinion, how important it is for employers to encourage contribution to open source projects? If you're happy to word that as overall, how, I guess, valuable it is, and how proactive should the employer be about this?
It's a means to an end, and I do it because it works for us. I don't do it because I'm a nice guy, although I am a nice guy, but I do it because we extract a lot of value out of open source code. When we have open sourced code, there are clients that I have now that learned of us through that code that we allowed to be released. And there are contributions that we've received that came in because the code was open. There are improvements that were made. There are contracts that we've been able to win. And my employees themselves are happier because they understand that more people are able to look at and validate that the work that they're doing is good work, and they're able to more easily see the impact that it's having on other people that are using it. So all these things mean that it's the right business decision for me. I'm not doing it just because, like, yay, open source. Like, this is it's a thing that improves my company and improves my career and their careers and everyone else's because we do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also believe, just generally, just because I know a lot of companies use open source, and if you just look at some of the OpenSSL bugs, it was discovered like just how little funding was actually going into OpenSSL. I think it's important for companies to look at it also as part of how they can contribute back to the community, because a lot of companies do use open source. They build their businesses on open source. And it does, like, it's good for the company because it's good marketing. It's good for recruiting. And it's good for your employees because it helps them grow their careers.
Yeah.
As a follow-on to that, do any of you try to like quantify, success around those sort of open source contributions? And, again, how do you attempt to do that to see what gives you the most bang for your buck?
Yeah. So at Komand, we haven't done a lot of open source, but at my last company, ThreatStack, like, we built our first product on top of one of my co-founders' open source products. So we contributed back to that product, and we used it more as a marketing. And again, I think the easiest way you can quantify is how many deals can you get. We got several recruits who came in from another thing that we kind of open sourced, like a tool for reading snort files. But we got some leads that came in that way, that became the employees of the company. All these different ways are ways you can quantify the value of open source. And again, like, it always helps especially if you're selling to other engineers or other technical people when they've heard about you before. And I think it's a simple way to do that.
Yeah. Number of contributions, number of sales leads, number of conference talks, number of hires as a result of them working on it and then me snatching them up. All these things are, like, I think I have about 4 or 5 people at Trail of Bits now that started as contributors to open source projects we released. And I knew they were good. Like, they de-risked the hiring decision-making process incredibly well because they were already doing things that I knew I could get paid to work on. So like that was just an easy decision for me to make. So I think it's actually fairly easy once you have the stuff out there to figure out what those quantifiers are.
Yeah, mine's totally different than these guys. It's all about achieving, useful work inside the organization. And so obviously open source tools don't always do what you specifically need them to do. They're lacking this feature, they have this bug, and so there have been tools we've wanted to use inside DataDog, and some of them are sort of security related, but aren't necessarily a security tool. And we've had to contribute fixes back to those to make it appropriate for use inside of DataDog. And so, of course, our option was maintain a fork in perpetuity and have to, incorporate merge-in fixes from the main line, and we don't want to get into that game, obviously. And so, for us, it's about, enabling us to use this tool that's going to drive some goal forward by being able to contribute that change back to the main line so that we can, jump into the main line and use that tool internally.
All right, we have time for one last question. Yes.
We avoid GPL like the plague. It's harmful to business. Like we license everything either MIT, BSD, or Apache because it enables flexibility in the way that my company can end up using that code in the future. And we end up seeing that more people that work at larger companies are like more willing to contribute to things that are BSD, MIT, Apache 2 licensed. Because they also know that if they want to bring it in-house and make some custom modification to it that they don't want to tell me about, they're free to do that. Whereas I think the GPL license restricts the activities that you can perform, especially from a corporate perspective. So it ends up like forcing it to be pushed into a hobbyist structure more than one where a day-to-day employee is using it to solve a business problem.
All right, great. So I want to thank Andrew, Dan, and Jen again for being a part of this panel. Round of applause for them.